Hey guys, in this video I'm going to be building the Erhardt E5 in 1/35 scale from Copper State Models. A quick disclaimer, the kit I received was a pre-production sample, so there may be some differences in this kit and the main release. Anyway, as usual, the instructions are really nicely laid out and easy to follow. The parts, as per usual, are nicely crisp and well detailed. All ejector pin marks are hidden on the interior surfaces of parts. The decals, as usual, are printed by Cartograph and are very nice. For this build, I'll also be using the dedicated Copper State photo etch set for this kit, as well as some 3D printed parts. All of these are available from the Copper State website. A quick comment on the 3D printed parts. Quite often, manufacturer supplied 3D printed parts come with really obvious layer lines, but luckily this isn't the case here. Any traces of printing are actually really minimal, and the parts are definitely a step up from those moulded in the kit. The only danger is thin parts like these legs on this oil can are very delicate, so you've got to be quite careful when using them. Anyway, let's get on with the build. For all styrene to styrene gluing in this build, I'm using VMS fast setting styrene cement. The build starts on the underside of the chassis, specifically with the gearbox, which is supplied in two parts. This is then mounted to the underside of the chassis. This was then followed by one of the drive shafts. The next step was to tidy up some of the chassis beams. As per usual on parts like this, there were some mould seams to remove, but a quick pass with a sanding stick and the parts were okay. These parts were then glued onto the lower floor of the vehicle, making up the entire chassis in a H-frame style assembly. The nice thing about this is because you're gluing it to a plate, you won't end up with parts that are slightly misaligned. The majority of the interior on this build won't be seen, but because I'm a bit of a perfectionist, I decided to fill in some of the ejector pin marks. I did this by dolloping in a reasonable amount of sprue glue, enough to fill the hole, leaving it to dry for 24 hours or so, and then sanding the excess away. This was started with around 600 grit, moving down to 1200. With those ejector pin marks filled in, it was time to move on with the rest of the lower chassis. To install the axles, you had to do a little bit of gymnastics. This involved bending some parts slightly so the axles could fit properly. And once the axles are in place, you could release the parts that you bent back into their original position. As you can see, Sausage Fingers here had a little bit of trouble, but it came out alright in the end. The interior was primed with Mr. Surfacer 1500 Grey. This was thinned with about 60% Mr. Leveling Thinner. For all airbrushing on this build, I'm using my Hutter & Steenbeck 0.15 Infinity Ultra CR. The upper areas of the interior walls were painted with SMS White. This was again moderately thinned with Mr. Leveling Thinner, about 60%. The floor and parts of the side walls were then painted with SMS Camo Black. Again, because the interior isn't really going to be seen, the paint job here is quite rudimentary. Just enough to get the job done. The radiator was primed with Mr. Colour GX2, an extremely glossy black, before being painted with a highly thinned mix of Super Metallic 2, Super Gold 2, and again Mr. Leveling Thinner. This was sprayed around 80% thinner to 20% paint. This was built up in really light layers to preserve the shine. The grille on the radiator was painted with a mix of black and gunmetal acrylic paints. While the paint was still wet, I randomly mixed in some black to that gunmetal. This gives the radiator a mottled kind of worn appearance. This was then glued in place on the front end of the chassis. Unusually, Copper State don't supply an engine with this model. It's a bit of a break of trend for them, but I don't mind personally. Anyway, the whole superstructure went together fairly nicely. There was very little faffing involved. And with assemblies like this, something being very slightly out can knock the rest out in a big way. Luckily, it didn't happen here. I could have done with an extra hand though. I did need to use some tape whilst gluing the front end together, just to make sure everything's set straight and with a strong bond. It was at this point I masked off all the interior windows with tape. Because I was posing some hatches open later, I didn't want any overspray going inside the vehicle. I don't think it would have been seen, but it's best to be tidy. After this, the lid was carefully dropped into place. Or the roof. Lid, roof, same thing. The various panels and hatches were then placed on the front end of the vehicle. After some effort putting it in place. There we go. Extra glue was then run around the panel line of the hatch just to make sure it was secure. I glued in the replacement 3D printed grille with VMS Flexi 5K black superglue. This part was a drop-in replacement and needed no modifications to fit. That's some good design. The rear of this was then masked to protect the radiator. Those are some big gaps, which is a prime opportunity for some paint to get in, so I didn't take any chances. The grille and front end of the vehicle were then glued carefully in place. This did require a little persuasion for the part to stay in place. Another version of the grille is also supplied on the photo etch fret, so here's a comparison of all the parts. I thought the kit part was definitely too thick, but the photo etch part I thought was slightly too thin, which made the 3D part a good middle ground. I misplaced some of the grab handles, so these were replaced with 0.4mm brass wire. Once I managed to get these parts straight and true, I think they looked better than the kit parts anyway. After the handles were done, the engine hatch was glued carefully into place. I think the little padlock details on these are quite cool. Next up, the fenders were added. The locator points for these were pretty positive, so everything glued together nice and straight. One of the main features on the photo etch fret are lots of hatches, so I decided to use these on this build. Some parts needed folding, and you also needed to round off the hinge part. This wasn't too tricky, but it was time consuming. And you'll see the process in a second. Anyway, the parts were carefully cut away from the metal fret, and any burrs were sanded off. Please excuse the wobbly footage here. First up on the hatches, you had to fold and glue what I presume is a spring. I did this carefully with a 10A scalpel blade, before pressing it and burnishing it in place to make sure it was flat. I then used a piece of wire as a spacer to keep the hinges round. This was the most fiddly part, as you had to line up the triangle shape with the triangle shape on the part proper. In this example, I was somewhat unsuccessful. Nevertheless, the parts were glued carefully into place with, once again, VMS black superglue. This looks messy, but in reality the parts are really small, and as is the amount of glue I used. So when not crazily zoomed in, this actually looks alright. I don't know if these macro extension tubes I'm using are a blessing or a curse. With the majority of the hatches done, it was time to move on to the turret. The assembly on this was fairly straightforward and fit really nicely. The hatches for the turret needed to be slightly bent. I did this by rolling them with a brush handle, before once again fixing them in place with VMS black superglue. In the photo etch set, there's also replacements for the rear steps used to enter the vehicle. To fit these, I had to remove the moulded plastic part with a razor saw. The etch parts were then glued into place. The only downside to these parts is that they were butt joined, which means there was only a small surface area on which to apply glue. Luckily, the VMS glue held well and the parts didn't break off. The 3D printed oil cans were then glued in place, again with black VMS superglue. I had a little trouble keeping these in place, but I got there in the end. Photo etch parts were also provided in the set for the guards on top of the roof. To make these fit properly, I had to drill holes in the right locations. To do this, I taped the part next to where it was supposed to be and used the pins on the part as a guide to drill the holes. The part was then dropped straight into place. Now it's time to get some paint on this Erhardt. The exterior was primed with Mr. Surfacer 1500 Black. This was thinned with around 65% Mr. Leveling Thinner. The primer was built up with overlapping lines, making sure not to miss anywhere. The base colour for these vehicles remains a bit of a mystery, but it's along the lines of a field grey. For my shadow colour, I used AK Real Colour Dunkelgrau. This was built up in my usual black based method, modelling the paint and leaving the paint thinner around areas where I wanted shadow to appear the strongest. The AK Real Colour Dunkelgrau has a slight green tinge to it, that's why I used it for the base colour. I really enjoy the black basing process, it's kind of therapeutic. Once the shadow colour was complete, I glued the rear fenders into place. I left these off before painting so I could paint the wheels properly. To the AK Real Colour Dunkelgrau, I added some MRP RLM02. This wasn't a precise mix, just enough to lighten the base colour. This was then built up as a middle tone and the start of my highlight tones. I had to be careful not to obscure any areas that I wanted left in the darker shade. To further lighten my mix, I used some MRP Heriokushoku blue-grey version. Again, a few drops were added by eye until the colour was sufficiently lightened. This was then used as a final highlight layer. This was sprayed on any areas that I wanted to pop significantly, or any panels or details I wanted to highlight. The edges of hatches and raised details are great for this because it really makes them pop. Final highlights were then added to the last uppermost areas of the hull. As a nice extra detail, I painted the unditching boards with some oil painted wood grain, which was given a layer of some chipping fluid before being sprayed in the main grey colour of the vehicle. This was then chipped away to reveal the wood grain underneath. Being lacquers, this took a little bit longer than usual, but the result was excellent. It's now time to add some decals to the vehicle. All surfaces on which I'm going to apply decals were prepared just before I added the decal with VMS Decal Set and Fix. This is a really strong decal adhesive and works great for getting those decals bedded down. Once the set and fix was applied, the decal was dipped into warm water for about a second. After a few seconds set aside, the decal was ready to be applied to the model. These were then carefully slid into place and manipulated with a brush or a fresh blade. Some of the decals had to go over some rivets. To make sure these conformed properly, once the decal had been put in place, I brushed over a layer of VMS decal softener. The radiator grille had a big German cross plastered all over it, and this was supplied as a decal by Copper State. Helpfully, Copper State provided a guide showing you where to cut the decal to make sure it fit to the grille properly in the open position. The decal was carefully cut with a steel rule and a fresh 10A scalpel blade. Each strip was then carefully applied to the radiator grille. With the decals in place, it was time to do some light colour modulation with acrylics. For this, I used a mix of AK Field Grey Base 2, Vallejo M.1917 Light Green Grey, Humbrol Gen 2 78, and Vallejo 925 Blue. By mixing these colours together, I could achieve various tones and shades of the base colour of the vehicle. I started with the light green grey and the field grey, just to match the overall shade of the model, and then added the blue and green for variation. This was done on a wet palette so I could use the paint over several hours. These mixes were then brushed onto raised rivets and surface details to add extra visual interest and also break up the surface. This is a very subtle effect, but it can look quite effective if done well. Any silly mistakes were carefully cleaned off quickly with a damp brush. This is usually quite a fun process, but when there are hundreds of rivets, it can get a bit time consuming. Oh well, it's worth it in the end. The entire model was then given a layer of VMS Matte Varnish HD to seal in the decals and protect my earlier paintwork. It was here I noticed I had some particularly nasty silvering on some decals on the front of the vehicle. This was probably down to the decals being left for too long in my water. I accidentally washed away all the adhesive. Anyway, these were carefully removed with some old tape. And then I meticulously painted the decals back in place. It's not a perfect solution, and I was really frustrated with this, but it came out okay in the end. If I could have any future build where I don't have to repaint a decal by hand, I'll be a very happy guy. And before anyone mentions using a gloss, I've not been glossing now for about 2 years, and my decal failure rate is extremely low. It's all about that adhesive. To add further weathering to the model, I did some chipping with Chip & Nick CN01. This is a nice dark, worn steel colour. Well, it's actually kind of a dark brown, but it kind of fits that image in my head. Anyway, this was applied over the entire model with an old piece of sponge. With sponge chipping, the finer the sponge you have, the smaller your chips will be, but it's also a lot harder to control, as it's easy to overcompress the sponge and get a large blob instead of some small chips. So you've just got to be a little careful when dabbing your paint on. Here I'm gluing on one of the 3D printed jacks of the kit. This was a marked improvement over the kit part and looked really good. I painted it with a few different shades so it would stand out from the model. The headlights were based with Mr. Colour GX2 Gloss Black, a perfect base for metallics and chromes. This was once again thinned with Mr. Leveling Thinner. For the insides of the lights I used Alclad Chrome. This was built up in several light, dusty layers. This helps to preserve the shine. For the outside of the lights, I used Mr. Hobby Super Gold 2 again. This goes down really nicely. For the metallic parts on the machine guns, I used Alclad Steel mixed with some MRP Black and Burnt Iron. The metallic areas were then masked off before painting the sleeves in various shades of field grey. The MGs were glued into place before adding the final hatches around them. As I was after the paint stage, these were glued in place with a regular VMS Flexi 5K CA for photo etch. Now it's time for some oil weathering. To start with, I mixed up some Abtalung 502 Sepia with VMS Universal Weathering Carrier Light. This was then applied as a pin wash around all the rivet detail, in the panel lines and around any raised detail that required it. Any excess was then cleaned up with the same brush, slightly dampened with Universal Weathering Carrier Light. I then used a light grey oil brusher to add some streaks to the side of the vehicle. Streaks isn't something I often do, and I really want to try and do it more. That's why I decided to try it on this vehicle. This was left to dry for a few minutes before being streaked with a wide, flat brush. The brush I'm using is a Terry Harrison flat rake. It's not perfectly flat on the edge, meaning it's perfect for streaking. Streaking like this usually takes several passes to get the result you want, and it's important to try and keep the streaks straight. Once the streaking was done, I added some more artificial shadows with some Abtalung 502 Shadow Brown. This was brushed into areas I wanted more shadow and then gently blended out. I then added some rust streaks with some VMS Pigment Jockey colours. These were brushed onto the model surface carefully. You don't want to use too much, and then blended in a downward streaking motion with a thin brush dampened with thinner. I wanted this vehicle to be slightly muddy, so I used some VMS mud pigments and mixed this with some of their alkyd binder. The pigments I used for this were EU Dark Earth and EU Brown Earth. They were mixed up with a few different ratios and then brushed over the model. After about 15 minutes, I blended these in with a soft brush and a stippling motion. To add some more natural variation to the mud and earth, I speckled some pigment mix over the brush painted mud. Because I was emulating dried splashes, I tended to lean more towards some of the EU Brown Earth. I think the richness of the earth colours contrasts nicely with the dull grey. I then mixed in some black and brown oil paint with the EU Dark Earth pigment. This was to simulate some darker areas of mud. Once again, this was brushed on and carefully blended in. I was careful not to apply too much of this dark mix because too much could overdo the effect. And this is how far I went with my Erhardt E5 in 1/35 scale by Copper State Models. Don't forget to subscribe to LPJ Models if you want to see more videos. Also, feel free to leave a comment, let me know how I've done. And also don't forget to hit that like button. Before we go, I'd like to give a huge thanks to my Patreons for supporting my work. Your support is much appreciated, thank you. I'd also like to thank Copper State for sending over this kit and its accessories for me to build. I'm sorry it's taken so long. Anyway, once again, let me know what you think. What would you have done differently? I'm going to leave you with the final images now. My name's James from LPJ Models. Thanks for watching.